From the great halls of their house, there are assembled three who hope to one day be the world's greatest driving heroes. Created from the cosmic legends of the universe comes our team captain, the Vision, Bill Fisher. Their soon-to-be Wonder Woman, Vicky Fisher. Our Captain Marvel and head flight trainee, Jennifer Skripchuk. And our Batman, the master of tools, gadgets, and all things mechanical, our mild-mannered soon-to-be billionaire, Alan Danvers. Their mission, to fight injustice, share what is right and wrong, to get you out of your house and come out racing with them, and serve all mankind. They are the Garage Heroes in Training Team.
Welcome to Garage Heroes and Training Podcast. I'm going to be one of the hosts for this episode, and my name is Bill. Who else is hosting?
I'm Vicky.
You are. Vicky, we have a guest.
Yep, we do.
We have a good guest.
We do.
He is someone who I friended on Facebook a few weeks ago, and I can tell that this man is never bored. He, in his free time, is the owner of Grass Paddock Motorsports, which does a lot of B Spec rentals. So everybody already knows why we're talking about this. He's been a racer since 2018 in B Spec. He is considered the stepfather of B Spec. And now he is, it looks like he's going to be, he's anxiously waiting his second child called C Spec, which we're going to get into. And then we'd like to welcome to the podcast, Frank Schwartz. Welcome to the podcast, Frank.
Thank you for having me.
Excellent. So we were, I'll give you the history on how we got into this little area of discussion. We were looking at Grid Life Sunday Cup. And basically, it was B Spec without the cage requirements for the wheel-to-wheel because it's a time trial type thing. And then we started liking it so much that we decided we were going to buy one. And then, race car guy, we have three now, and we're working on it. It's a problem, but we acknowledge it's a problem. That's fine.
Don't say we. Don't throw we in there.
I like to have everybody involved, So then we were checking out Sunday Cup, and then, to be fair, Vicky and I are both mostly NASA babies because SCCA around us, we haven't really interacted with. We got to figure out where they are. They're hidden. But then we started checking out B Spec, and I was like, we could do some of that too. So that seemed like fun. And then everybody said, when we were trying to figure out what's going on with B Spec, they said, you should have Frank on. So we reached out to you, and for some reason you said yes. And, that's how we got here. So, that's kind of our introduction to how we got to the subject, but maybe you could help our listeners out with how you got into this and kind of some of your history and see how you became the stepfather for B Spec and the papa to be on C Spec.
Yeah, so maybe go back. I'm from Europe originally and was always around sports car racing, and then as a child we moved to North Carolina, so I was around circle track racing. So I'm like this odd combination who idolized growing up Richard Petty and Pedro Rodriguez. I mean, like there's no way.
So close.
They're so close. and I always wanted to be a race car driver, but financially the family was always struggling to make ends meet, and there was like no friends or anybody was anywhere associated with cars. Like, nobody in my family changed their own oil, nor did we know anybody who changed their own oil. So it was really a distant dream that just kind of went away. And I'm 18 years old. I've got a 1968 Firebird. And I'm on my way to the beach with the girlfriend because we lived on the coast of North Carolina. And I go by the local high school, and they have back then, driver's ed was part of high school classes. And they had a driving range, and there were a whole bunch of people in the driving range with cars squealing tires. And this caught my attention. So we pulled over, and I went up to the fence, and I'm watching, and this guy comes over from to the fence and says, "Hey, does this look like fun to you?" And I'm like, "Oh my God, this is the greatest thing since sliced bread." And he said, well, you can enter, I'm like, I don't have a race car. He said, no, these are all street cars. I'm like, really? So
Wow.
we didn't go to the beach. I took my Firebird out in F stock and got my tail handed to me by a four-door Pontiac Phoenix, uh,
Mhm.
of all things, in F stock that day. But I was hooked. Like, oh my God, this is like possible. So that person is actually Ken Payne, who ended up being head of Michelin Motorsports North America.
Oh
Wow.
wow.
And he's the one who kind of got me started. So we're in a small town in North Carolina, and very small. We're not even a region. We're a chapter of the region because we're so far away from everybody else in that region. Cape Fear chapter of North Carolina region, SCCA.
Oh wow.
And that's about the time they started talking about improved touring. And
Hmm.
this was so exciting to me. Like, this is a kind of racing maybe I can afford. So I bought a old junker BMW 2002, and I'm going to go uh, IT racing until I realized how expensive the BMW parts were. And I got rid of that car and I bought a Ford Fiesta, and that's how I started in SCCA racing.
Hmm.
And from a talent point of view, I was better than average. But from a financial point of view, obviously, I'm in the cheapest form, the cheapest class. I'm doing the least amount of prep work. I'm driving my car to the track because I don't even have a tow vehicle or a tow dolly or anything like that. And I drove from coastal North Carolina to Summit Point, West Virginia for my first driver's school.
Oh wow.
And the suspension was so stiff on the way, the spark plugs broke. So I had to leave the car on the side of the road and hitch to a parts store and come back with, I didn't even have a spark plug socket wrench with me or anything. So, really shoestring budget in the beginning. And, as I raced more and more, got more and more involved in the club, I thought, these are things maybe the club could do better, and always tried to suggest and help grow things. But um, it never really stuck. The club is, run by volunteers, many of which have been in the club for 20 years, and they have a system. And this is not a criticism. They know what works, and they just keep doing that. So new ideas are very difficult to get included. And at some point, B Spec became a pro class, I think in the early 2011, 2010, 2011. And I thought, if I had money, this was really, this was like the ultimate pinnacle of somebody who raced uh, low horsepower front wheel drive cars.
Hmm.
So I'm still a regional racer with the Fiesta, on and off. And then the SCCA announced the runoffs at Indy for 2017. And I'm like, after 30 years of regional racing, I'm like, okay, I got to do a national, and I got to go to Indy because, that's, a lifelong,
Sure.
not just a dream, but a proof that I have arrived. If I can drive an Indy, then I really am a race car driver, right?
Hmm. Absolutely.
So a friend of mine rented H Production CRXs, Honda Ron Racing. So I rented cars from him, and I did my first national level events, called majors, of course, at that point, and qualified for the runoffs and went to the runoffs and drove across the bricks at Indy and practiced and cried.
Wow.
And
Wow.
but the realization of running that year in H production cars, they're a little finicky. They need constant work and maintenance. And, while I'm mechanically inclined, I'm not a mechanic, and I like to drive, but I don't really like to work on cars.
Hmm.
So, um, in our group was B Spec. And, at that point, it's like, oh my God, I don't need to rent a car. I need to buy a B Spec. And,
Right.
and because I had raced Fiestas and improved touring, I tried to buy a Fiesta that was for sale. Deal fell through. And the very next car that came up for sale was a Mini Cooper, and my street car was a Mini Cooper, so I thought that made sense. And so in August of 2018, August 5th or 6th, it was a Monday, I bought my Mini Cooper B Spec car, and the following weekend I did my first major weekend in the Mini and finished third. So I was pretty excited. And then David Doherty got in touch with me and said, "You need to go to the runoffs in Sonoma." And I'm like, there's no way I can afford to go to the runoffs in Sonoma. And I'm like, how am I ever going to get my car and get qualified and everything like that? And he said, "I can help you." And that's what he did. He found me a seat in a car at High Plains in Colorado, and then a seat in another car at MSR in Houston. And I flew to those places, and I qualified for the runoffs. And driving other people's cars, thanks to John Phillips down in Texas and Jim Jordan out of California for helping me. And then looking at the cost to tow my car to California, it really was kind of tough to do that for one race. So I made the decision to tow my car out to California and then leave it there, and then fly out in January and February and March and race California tracks. And it's during all this time that people are calling me and telling me, "Oh, what an idiot you are. B Spec is dying. Dorsey Schroeder said it on the runoffs announcements. And, in 2017, the class is going to go away." And I thought, well, this is a prime opportunity for me to take all those ideas and suggestions I've had for 30 and 40 years and put a plan in place to grow the class. And that's what we did, with a lot of help from a lot of people. I may have put the plan together and kind of focused everybody, but a lot of people did a lot of work to get us to the point where at Indy last year we had 61 cars, third largest class in the country.
It just seems like it sounded like somebody just needed to really take charge of it.
Well, it's one of the things, when I talk to people about racing, and because I'm an engineer, so I'm very spreadsheet and data oriented, but I'm also a businessman, so I'm very, what makes sense for business and the finances side of things. I really had to look at the data about what's happening in racing and how do we grow it. And what I found was most people expect the SCCA national office or the volunteers in the CRB to do the work to make their class of racing successful, and it's just wrong. I disagree with that philosophy, because it's like a parent who has 12 Girl Scout children. Like, how do you tell somebody buy Girl Scout cookies from one of my kids but not the other 11?
Right.
So the SCCA has all of these classes. You can't expect them to market each class individually, and that's the fallacy in all forms of motorsports, is we market the organization, we don't market the class.
Right.
And
Right.
one of the things I found was we lose more people in motorsports because they get involved in the wrong kind of racing. For example, if you like to fabricate, B Spec is not a class for you, because there's really no fabricating.
Right.
But you should probably be in a GT class or a H production class. If you like working on cars, and there are plenty of people who like working on cars, there's classes for that. How many people you want to race against, that's important. Because if you're one of those people who enjoys going fast and you really don't care if you're racing anybody, there's a lot of classes that work for you. But if you want to do the mano matching wits with somebody, chess, I'm going to set them up 3 corners before I actually pass them, kind of a strategy process, there are only certain classes that give you that sort of opportunity, because the people are spread out so much, because the tracks are spread out so much.
Yeah.
So all of these things are critical to find out what's the right class for you. And how do most people get involved in racing? A friend says, hey, get involved in this, you'll really enjoy it. And you're like, oh, this is something I want to do. And then they'll tell you, oh, there's this great Spec Miata that's for sale. It's a great price. You should buy it. And then you buy it only to find out a year later that you really dislike bodywork. And
Right.
Spec Miata is not the class for somebody who dislikes bodywork.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not a criticism of Spec Miata, right? What's great about Spec Miata is no matter where you go in the country, you will always have somebody to race with.
Right.
It's the only class that gives you that, right?
Sure.
What's not great for me about Spec Miata is all the cars are very similar in performance, which means they brake at the same point, they turn in at the same point, they apex the same point, you're back on the gas at the same point. So passing becomes a very difficult process because there's no real high level performance difference between the guy in front of you and you. So it kind of invites,
You're just waiting for somebody to mess up.
or it
force
invites making low percentage passes, force it. Exactly.
Yeah.
So it's for me, it's one of the things that's kind of cool about B Spec is the fact that we have different chassis and they're all good in different ways. We had a race at Homestead, Miami a couple of years ago where the second and third place cars were a Mazda 2 and a Mini Cooper, and they passed each other multiple times a lap for multiple laps in the race.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
And, they probably had more real wheel-to-wheel racing experience inside of one race than some people might get in a year.
Mm-hmm.
In another class. And I had a renter recently tell me that in the course of racing in the B Spec rental that he did more passing and setting people up than he did in a whole year of racing in his other class. And I'm not going to say what class that is because, again, every class has positives and every class has negatives. So you just got to find which one works for you.
Mm-hmm.
You know?
Yeah. We say the same thing because we do a lot of endurance racing. It's like find the one that fits your personality because you're not going to be happy in one that doesn't, and you try and change it.
Yeah.
So where do you see yourself going with all this?
I have no idea.
No.
I mean, look, I'm in my 60s now. I had planned to always kind of make the racing hobby more of a business. When I retired, and the pandemic just kind of brought that stuff forward. I had free time on my hands, so racing was something we could do outdoors in a safe way during the pandemic. So I just thought it was a great opportunity to use my extra time to kind of build the Grass Paddock Motorsports brand ahead of my actual retirement.
Yeah. Are you going to retire into motorsports, do you think?
Well, I'm a pretty active guy, so
yeah.
I don't ever really see myself sitting down. I like to travel. I like having friends all over the country and meeting new people and getting people involved in the sport. So yeah, I'll do that till I can't do that anymore.
Bill and I have talked about that. Bill and I have talked about that also. We have just thought about, where are we going to, because I mean, we're in our 50s and, kind of seeing forward about, what is that going to look like going forward? Planning our next stage of life. And of like, I think we're going to retire into instructing, which is, I see a lot of retirees doing that, which is great. I mean, it's a great community.
It would help if you didn't get sick when you're in the right seat.
I know. I'm still working on that. I got to work through it. So,
I gave up on the right seat stuff many years ago. When I started, if my ITC Fiesta came from the factory with 60 some horsepower, and I think in IT trim it had 80, and that's that's a pretty easy thing to right seat. And you got minivans coming from the factory with 300 horsepower now. That's a different thing to right seat in. So I kind of stop when, and track days are another thing. Not to get off on a tangent, but I understand why track days are successful, and I understand why people enjoy that. I'm kind of not the same way. I like the matching width part of racing. I don't necessarily have to go really, really fast to make myself happy, because the speed is relative. I'm very happy with the speed of a B Spec car. I don't have to have 300 horsepower to make me happy on a track. But one of the things that I've seen is, people are like, okay, I want to go wheel-to-wheel racing. How many HPDEs do you suggest I do before I pursue racing? And I'm like, maximum one. And they're all like, what do you mean maximum one? That makes no sense. And in the old days, we didn't have HPDEs. So your first time driving on a track at speed was during driver's school.
Right.
So if you can imagine a student comes to the track, their speed skill is zero and their racecraft is zero. And over the course of the weekend, maybe they advance them to 2 or 3 on a scale of 1 to 10, right? They move it up some, but they kind of move them up together. And what I started seeing with the HPDE side of things is people were coming to driver school and their speed was already a 7 or an 8, but their racecraft was 0. And I just found, in my opinion, again, that that was not a very safe mix. Right? So I've always told people, if you want to race, just go to school. If you want to drive fast, that's fine. Go to HPDEs, but don't feel like you have to, become skilled and experienced in HPDEs before you go to a driver's school. If anything, go autocrossing, because autocrossing teaches you car control at a very low level where, there's not a real critical bad outcome if you make a mistake.
Right.
So, do you have one of my favorite questions? Do you have a race philosophy? Do something you tell yourself?
Yeah. So when I was in my 30s, I think I was fairly talented. When I started autocrossing in the Southeast United States, the top guy that everybody was aiming for was Randy Popst. And as I started and did some events with him and other people who were really talented, I found I had a lot of talent for autocrossing before I got into road racing. And then I seemed to do okay in road racing too. I would say I'm a better autocrosser than road racer. But I would say in my 20s and 30s, I was wound too tight. And I win a pretty high percentage of my races, and I've always been pretty good about setting track records and stuff. But I would not necessarily say that I ended weekends happy. And I don't understand what it was about it that was making me unhappy, because if I won, I didn't win by enough, or I won and I didn't set a track record, or I set a track record and didn't win. And a friend of mine by the name of Charlie, who raced against me and has also crewed for me quite a few times, and I were sitting around I don't know if we were around a fire pit or somebody was cooking, or I remember there was heat. It was cold, but there was heat, whatever it was. And we're having an adult beverage, and I'm like, Charlie, like you're mid-pack. Your best finish in your life has been maybe 7th out of 30, but you're always happy. And here I am. I won the championship last year, and I'm never like happy. And he's like, it's pretty simple for me. The car goes on the trailer like it came off the trailer. I'm faster than the last time I was at the racetrack, and I had a meaningful battle with somebody on the track, even if I lost. To me, that's a successful weekend, and that makes me really, really happy. And it kind of hit me at that point that every weekend I went into, I had never sat down and defined what was it going to take to make me happy before the weekend.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, goal setting and, you know, there's a lot of jokes about, you know, happiness being a choice. And I didn't realize that I was choosing not to be happy because I could never be successful because I couldn't sit down and define what was success. So I think my philosophy for that is, and something I tell people is, you know, decide very early on what it's going to take to make you enjoy this and be happy with it, and you know, then set up a program to accomplish those things. And for me, you know, I enjoy driving. Don't get me wrong, but there's something about seeing the smile out of a person who gets out of the car after their first session at a driver's school
Mm-hmm.
that just warms me up. And I try and take pictures of my renters during the course of going through that process, and you know, just seeing them the first time they get a trophy, and getting out of a car the first time they get out of a car that's set up properly and handles properly and does what they're supposed to do. You know, that's the downside of kind of building your own race car. Typically in the beginning, it doesn't handle right. And
Mm-hmm.
it certainly doesn't handle right for you. So it takes a while to get there if you have the skill to make that happen. So, you know, it's one of the things I try to do with the cars that I give my drivers is, you know, they handle correctly for their skill level, and then we can change the handling as their skill level improves. And just the enjoyment of watching them go through that process has been pretty cool. Makes me happy.
I think we need him to join our team.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure we've ever driven a car that handles right yet. Well,
Yeah,
one
and,
less.
you know, 30 years of front wheel drive, low horsepower front wheel drive racing. Again, I'm an engineer, but I'm not a suspension engineer, and I'm mechanically inclined, but not a mechanic. And then you add that to the fact that I don't like working on race cars. You know, it's kind of brought me to a point where I've got a package that I feel comfortable in, and I'm comfortable putting unskilled people in, and I can show them and help them how to improve. So we do quite a bit of coaching as well. So
I think the only downside I see with this situation is that takes away one of our excuses, Frank. I mean, if we have a car that's set up right, we can't blame the car. I mean, you know.
well, yeah, but you know, again, there's if the measurement is everybody is out there to win, then we're going to have a lot of unhappy race car drivers because there's only one winner, right? So, you know, this comes back to me and saying, you know, what is your reasonable target that's going to make you happy? If there's 15 cars in class, you know, aim for the top half. And then when you get there, aim for a little bit higher and work on your skill set. And, you know, if you get stuck, then get some coaching, or, you know, start learning on how to read data and you know, coach yourself. You know, striving to be the best you can be versus striving to be the best of everybody is two completely different things, and one makes people a whole lot happier than the other.
Yeah, I think our team is always revolved on just trying to be a little better each time. That's all.
Yeah, I mean, you know, not to like drop stats, or, you know, it's not something that I'm trying to emphasize here, but, you know, I win quite a bit. But if I look back over the past couple of years, the races I remember were the ones where I had a really tight battle with somebody who drove at a level that I respect, and I didn't win. Connor Kelleher and I had a race for second and third place at Road Atlanta, I think it was in 2021, one of my favorite races ever. I wasn't close to winning that race, but it ranks up there like on one of my top 3 or 4. The 2018 runoffs, I made a mistake. I had an accident, dropped all the way back to 8th, and I fought my way back to 3rd by the end of the race. And then at the end of the race, there was a protest about the way I was driving, and I accepted it and, got penalized because of it. But, it doesn't take away. That was just a phenomenal, fun race for me to fight back from 8th place.
Mm-hmm.
The trophy doesn't matter, but the memory I have of that race and learning a track I'd never driven before and chipping away at the cars in front of me and even a runoffs race is really 35-40 minutes. It's short, so passing 5 cars over not even all the laps, that took a lot of work and effort on my part, and it was extremely satisfying, right?
Absolutely.
And I didn't win,
Mm-hmm.
So there's 2 examples where I didn't win that mean more to me than all of the wins I have. Right. So it's just a matter of, figuring out what are the triggers that are going to make you feel happy and satisfied and defining them before the weekend and then working on them.
Mm-hmm. So just in case people aren't fully up to speed, you never know, this could be their first ever investigation of racing and maybe even listening to our podcast. Thank you for tuning in. Let's take it one step back a little bit and get into why somebody would want to spec race, or what's the advantages of spec race versus like a building type class.
So running in H production, where I would say the top cars are probably $30,000 cars. One of the things that was frustrating for me in the beginning of my racing career is, holy smokes, who has $30,000 to just build a car? And what you learn as you race in that class over time is nobody. All of these people started with $5,000 cars, and they've been racing them for 15 years, and they put $2,000 in every year. And they just keep upgrading and upgrading and improving and upgrading and changing a philosophy and upgrading and improving. And that's how they get to the pointy end of the field.
Mm-hmm.
And that's wonderful. The idea from a spec class is we're going to limit the things that you can do to kind of take that development curve away, so that at least in B Spec, most of the cars are only allowed one particular brand and part number of shock absorbers and struts. So there's no 5-year investigation. Are the Coneys better than the Bilsteins? Are the what other company, and what spring rates, and all of these development things that have to happen to get to the most performance out of your car. So in a spec class, a lot of that stuff is there. Obviously, there's a difference between Spec Miata and B Spec, because even in a spec class, there's things that you can do, right? So like you get parasitic driveline loss from the U-joints in a rear-wheel drive car. So, having the best U-joints possible gives you another 1/10 of a second or 100th of a second. Or, having the best wheel bearings gets you, this incremental improvement. So in B Spec, we're even more restrictive than a class like Spec Miata in terms of what's allowed. So somebody can get involved in a class and be in a competitive car in their first year and not have to develop the car over multiple years.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Part of that is because there's limited modifications you can make, but there's another part of it, and that is the culture in our classes. We share just about everything. When I built a car in 2019 and took it to the runoffs and sat on the pole, And then immediately after the runoffs, I wrote a blog post and I literally put an Excel spreadsheet up with every part number that was in my car, and a basic recipe on how to build an identical car to mine. And my rationale behind it was, if I beat you, I don't want to beat you because I have a secret you don't have. I want to beat the best you that you can be. So we should be in fundamentally equivalent cars.
Sure.
But that's, the other side of racing, building a better car, that's also part of racing. And there's people who enjoy that too. It's just not me, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's more of a driver versus a builder or a dollars race.
Yep.
Yeah. All right, so let's get into the bulk of what we're going to talk about, the B Spec. We talked about it a little bit, but what are B Spec cars, I guess?
So the head of Honda Motorsports and Mazda Motorsports back in the early 2010s got together and decided that they would put a class of racing together for their B segment cars. So all in the auto industry, every car size has a classification. So there's like A segment, B segment, C segment, D segment, E segment, which are like the big full-size cars like Crown Victorias and so forth. And then there's A through E segment of SUVs and A through E segment of pickup trucks. And so all of these things, it's just an industry terminology about the size of a car. So the Honda Fit and the Mazda 2 were the B segment entries from those two companies, and they put together a program to race those two. And then Ford and GM got involved. Chrysler got involved with the Fiat, which actually the Fiat 500 is an A segment car, but Chrysler at that time didn't have a B segment car in the United States, so that's why they took that. And then Mini didn't get involved from a factory point of view. Brad Davis and the Mini dealership, the Hendrick dealership out of Charleston, South Carolina, got involved. And at that time, you had to buy new cars and you had to buy all the kits of the suspension and all of that kind of stuff from the factory. And that was their way to keep all the cars, equal in terms of balance and performance. And IMSA and others had a Pro Series, and that's how it got kind of started. And then SCCA said we should allow those cars to run on our amateur side, and that's kind of how it all got started back in 2011, 2012.
So, pluses and minuses for B Spec?
Well, I mean,
and the difference in the cars for B Spec, what do you think?
Yeah, all the cars have strengths and weaknesses, and we race at different tracks. So, as much as we try to work to make the cars equivalent in performance, I can't make them equivalent everywhere. So, for example, the Mazda 2 is the lightest car in class, so it has a performance advantage on really small, short, tight tracks with a lot of low-speed corners. But the gearing in the transmission is such that on long tracks like Road America or Daytona or VIR even, it's at a disadvantage because, a lot of the faster cars are running 6 speeds and the Mazda's a 5-speed. So there's holes between the gear ratios that hurt on the acceleration side of things. Mm-hmm. So for those reasons, the Mazda has a header that's allowed and it doesn't run a restrictor, whereas the faster cars run restrictors to slow them down. But we're trying to do everything we can to make them even. So Minis are the most popular car in the class. They're probably among the least reliable street cars in the class. They have known problems, but from the factory, a pretty high percentage, I think almost 50% of Mini Coopers are manual transmission. So, that was a big advantage. A whole lot easier to find a manual transmission Mini than it is to find a manual transmission Mazda 2. Right. I think that has a lot to do with why it's the most popular car in the class. The Hondas, of course, are going to be really good because of their reliability and the aerodynamics. The Ford Fiesta probably is the most powerful car in the class. It doesn't handle as well as some of the others. The Chevy Sonic it's the only car in the class with a 1.8 liter motor because it didn't come from the factory with a 1.6 like everybody else, or a 1.5. So it has a pretty small restrictor to kind of make it even. But there's going to be torque that the restrictor isn't going to take care of. So, it has some advantages there too. So, depending on what your loyalties are for a brand and what kind of tracks you're going to race at in your region, yeah, there's different cars that might give you a slight advantage over the others. But I've driven most of the cars in class. I've owned Minis and Hondas. And whereas they perform pretty similar, they drive a little bit different. So the one advantage I tell everybody about the Honda Fit, it's the only car in the class where you can actually fit a set of spare dry tires and a set of reins in the car.
This is good to know.
Yeah, it is. Right. So I know in one of my Minis, because of the cage design, I can't even get a single set of tires inside the car for safekeeping. But yeah, the Honda, you can get 2 sets in, and that's worth something in itself.
Sure. Well, I have a bunch of questions, but you got me worried here. So Vicky has a Fit and I have a Mini. So what's my weak spot on my Mini that you're concerned about?
Well, the Minis have issues on the cooling system from the thermostat to the crossover pipe and the water pump.
Okay.
And they have problems with the timing chains.
Okay. All right. I knew about those. We're good. I can handle those. I've already broken one Mini doing that.
So what's interesting about the Mini, of course, is it's the only car in class that has an independent rear suspension. So at the pointy end, in my opinion, the cars are pretty much even. But if you take an average driver, they're typically more comfortable faster in the Mini. And that comfort is going to translate into speed. So it's one of the reasons we have people who feel like the Mini needs more balance of performance adjustment than the other cars, because it's just an easy car to go faster. So, let's say the pole sitting guys are running at a minute 50 and the middle of the pack is running a minute 53 in a Honda. That same driver can probably jump in a Mini and do a minute 52 just because the car is more comfortable over bumps and alligator teeth, and it's a little more direct in terms of how it reacts to bad inputs, right?
Mm-hmm.
Famously, one of the past national champions drove a Mini and a Honda Fit back to back, and he said the Honda Fit handles better, and I don't doubt that a bit. I like I said, I owned Honda Fits. I set some track records with it, and I thought it was a really good handling car. But that you can't. A place like Sebring, as bumpy as it is, cars with a solid rear axle are going to suffer at Sebring compared to the independent rear suspension of the Mini. And I don't know how to balance that out. I don't know how to add weight or change restrictor size to get away from the fact that it's just a more comfortable car to drive in extreme situations for an unskilled driver.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Maybe more forgiving or tolerant, I guess.
Yeah.
Okay. Cool. Sounds like you got some work to do, Vicky.
So how do you find a good car to race?
Oh, that's tough. I mean, for the Minis, I recommend to people you don't buy a functioning running car. And the reason is, a functioning running car is going to cost you several $1,000s more than a broken one. And the first thing you're going to do when you buy it is you're going to replace the parts that you would replace on a broken one anyway. So you may as well start with a broken one to start. And it is one of the things that's kind of been bad about the pandemic and the chip shortages. The used car prices for donors have gone up substantially over the past couple of years. And what I built in 2019 for $10,500, I don't think I could build it today for 15 grand. And it's not because everything has gotten more expensive, but the donors are $3,000 more than I paid 3 years ago. And the cage is easily $1,500 more expensive from steel costs and people's labor costs. So, the tires and wheels and safety equipment and all of that kind of stuff has gone up by, 10 or 20%, or in some cases a little more. But the real changes are in the cost of the cage and the cost of the donor car. So, I tell everybody who's interested in racing, if you want to build a car, absolutely build a car if you enjoy that kind of stuff. But you'll never find a better deal than buying one that's already built. So we got a special Facebook webpage right now where we share cars that are for sale, and there's not a lot in B Spec. When I started in 2018, I think there were 35 cars in the country, and we're probably approaching 150 now in terms of cars that are completed. But I think there's probably 6 or 7 cars for sale at this moment. They just happen to be in parts of the country where the people who want to buy them aren't. Right. So
I know
if you're in Michigan and there's a car for sale in Texas, that's great. And, most of us will help and go take a look at the car. But most people, when they buy a race car, they want to see it themselves. So while they're kind of okay with going to Texas to buy a car, they're not okay with going to Texas just to look at a car from Michigan, or vice versa. Right.
Right.
So.
Yeah, I noticed that the infographic you have, which you put together, seems to have all the cars that are available, and the number keeps going down. So
it goes up and down. The most cars are available on an annual basis right after the runoffs, and then there's several cars that get sold at the runoffs that never even make it onto a Facebook page or an ad or any of that kind of stuff, because those deals are handshakes. Like one of my clients bought a car at the runoffs this year. And, the car was never listed or photographed or put up for sale anywhere. You have to be there to hear the rumor mill or the scuttlebutt, and then you have to put a deposit down and strike right then and there. So, and then the numbers dwindle through right after the runoffs. Most number of cars are for sale, and then they drop. Cars are taken off the market or sold, and then somewhere around springtime, the quantity starts building again until the runoffs where it hits its peak. So it's a cycle.
All right, so let's pretend, somebody has this plan, and they go out and they get a car. What do they need to do to convert like a regular street car? Could be driver, could be not driving, doesn't matter. What do they need to do typically to convert their car to be B Spec compliant?
Captain's log supplemental.
So, Miss Vicky.
Yes, sir.
Do you remember when we were watching those WRL events and some of those grid life events where you used to see the in-car video, and it had like the cameras seeing front and back, but it also could see all the telemetry and everything that was going on? Most of the ones that we liked were taken by the Sentinel system. Remember James came on our podcast earlier?
Right.
We have no excuse since he lent us one for trial and demonstration purposes. We should actually probably put that in one of our cars. Maybe 2.
I really think we should.
I think we should.
I know. Because
then we'd look like the immature endurance racing team that we are. Oh, wait, I mispronounced that, didn't I? Sorry, my bad. We could
so what does the Sentinel system do?
We could have 3 cameras with picture-in-picture. We could have, if we ever get the AIM system to work, open invitation to anybody from AIM to come on and give us a little bit of love. We need some help. And then we could have all our telemetry on there. And then we can have it streamed live into the paddock or around the world to our millions of fans. We're apparently very popular in Kenya right now. Don't know why, but that's fine. And it can integrate all the available race statistics from like Race Hero and everything. So we could actually see how we're doing on video. We wouldn't even have to carry around our phone anymore. Live.
I love it.
What do they need to do typically to convert their car to be B Spec compliant?
Well, it has to have a cage based on the SCCA rule book in terms of mounting points, which used to be in the old days 6 points, the 4 main hoops, and then 2 going back to the back of the car. And then later they added 2 allowed that would go from the front door bars, A-pillar bars to the firewall. And then, recently this year, they've started to allow the door bars to be attached to the sill of the car.
Okay.
So that's new. And certainly from a safety point of view, I would recommend people have their cages built that way now that that's allowed. There's no requirement for a racing seat, but again, from a safety point of view, I don't know why you would ever go on track without one. Right. And we have a lot of conversations about the levels of safety seats. So, I can list easily for somebody what's the safest equipment and car to put together, right, in terms of the cage, but that has a dollar cost attached to it. And we all make decisions of what level of safety we are comfortable with that's less than the maximum amount. So, if you have what's called a non-full containment racing seat and somebody comes up to you and tells you, that's not the safest seat you can have, that's true. But I can almost guarantee you they also don't have the safest seat that you can have. They just have a seat that's safer than yours, right?
Yep.
So you can spend $3,000 on a seat if you want to, or you can spend $350. And that's the biggest impact on the cost of putting together a race car is how much safety you're comfortable with and your budget allows you to put into the car. So, I would say don't scrimp on these things, but the reality is we all make those value judgments of what level we are comfortable with and we need. So, seat, you need a harness, you need a window net. The cage needs to have padding on it so that your helmet doesn't hit it. Obviously, from a driver point of view, you need fireproof everything: gloves, shoes, socks, a suit. There's a great example. The suit that most people buy is the minimum that's allowed by the club, which, if I remember correctly, is 3.2/5. And what that means is the suit will withstand a direct flame for 5 seconds, which isn't really a lot when you think about it. Yet that's what the majority of us have bought, right? So, there's other levels of suit flammability, safety, and you spend for that. So, helmet is a critical one for me. I always talk to people about I would never buy a helmet online that I haven't actually test fit. I have an odd-shaped head, and a large helmet from 3 different brands don't fit me the same. So, I would say go to a shop that has helmets in stock that allows you to try on several different brands and several different sizes to find what works. You need a Hans device or some level of head and neck restraint system. So if you think about it that way, you've got $2,500 in the cage, you've got $1,000 in all the other safety equipment, from the seat to the harnesses to a fire bottle or a fire system. I mean, again, you can buy a $2,000 fire system, but in B Spec, all we require is a $50 fire bottle.
Right.
So kill switches are not mandatory. Some people like them, some people don't. I'm personally not a fan of kill switches for the simple reason that car safety has come a long ways, and the ignition system in a modern street car is pretty darn safe. So unless you're 110% sure you know what you're doing, putting a kill switch in a car might actually make your car less safe if it's not properly installed and wired, right?
Absolutely.
So suspension, we have a standard shock kit for every car, which generally is between $1,000 and $1,500, and then you can run stiffer springs, which you're going to spend another $500 on. You're obviously going to want to put stainless brake lines on the car.
Right.
For people who don't know, the rubber brake lines work wonderful for street cars, but when a race car gets hot, they work like a balloon, so your brake pedal gets spongy. So the stainless lines don't do that. You're going to upgrade your brake pads for sure, depending on the level of grip that you want. There's multiple different compounds, so talk to somebody who's knowledgeable, who has a similar car. The faster drivers tend to use their brakes less. I know that kind of goes without saying, but I get twice as many races out of my brake pads than my renters get when they drive the same car. So that tells me how much more than me they're using the brakes. So there are brake pads that have a lot of bite very quick, but you can't be on the brakes for a long time because they build heat too much. And then there's other brakes that don't have a lot of initial bite, brake pads, and they go for a longer period of time. Obviously, full disclosure, we're sponsored by GHIT brakes, and we like all the different compounds they have. And I have multiple race cars, and based on the skill level and the talent level and the experience of the driver, I put different pads in the cars, based on that. So you're going to, wheels and tires, $1,000. If you can afford it and you can afford to see them sit, you're going to have a second set for reins. And if you can afford it, you'll probably have a third set as backup. And then engines, from a performance point of view, every car has different modifications that are allowed. Like some cars that are on the slower end of the spectrum get a header and a cold air intake, and cars that are on the faster end of the spectrum don't get any of that and have to run a restrictor plate. And then the engine brain, the ECU, you're allowed to tune it, which can be inexpensive or expensive depending on the brand of the car. Honda seem to be very easy to tune and inexpensive, and Mini Cooper seem to be very hard to tune and very expensive. So,
that makes Vicky happy.
At the end of it, that's kind of how you get to your $15,000 cost to put a car together.
Is there anything with sway bars or anti-sway bars, depending on which side of the pond you're on?
Yeah, most of the cars have a allowance to add a bigger rear sway bar. So
okay. And when you're saying tires, are you talking like 200 treadwear tires? Or are we talking race slicks, or what are we talking about?
So B Spec is a DOT class. So we did have a spec tire size, 205, 50, 15. And then a couple of years ago, the competitors and the rules committee voted to put a spec tire in place. So right now we run with a Hankook ZZ 214 tire.
They're good tires.
And we get a special price. So the tires are $165 a piece, which is more than reasonable. And many competitors have seen a longer life out of those tires too. So that's why I say, $100, $150 per wheel, and then $165 per tire. Not much more than $1,000 you've got a set.
Excellent. So as the owner of Grass Paddock Motorsports, you seem to be a renter of B Spec cars and seats. How exactly does that work?
Well, it's when I used to own a Ford Fiesta and improve touring, I was always of a mindset that I can't allow racing to take money out of, my kids' college fund and all of this kind of stuff. So I was always looking for ways to help support, the racing that I was doing. And as my car got faster and faster and I upgraded the springs and shocks and stuff like that, I had all these parts left over and I had parts cars. So I just built a second car. And my mentality back then was, rent one and that pays for me racing mine for the weekend. And then as the kids got older, I got away from racing for a while. So when I started again, that was always my mindset. And, after I had my first Mini, I bought a Honda. Because again, in the beginning, there weren't many cars for sale. Like I said, there were only 35 B Spec cars in the country that we could identify. So, for somebody like me who doesn't like to work on cars, I'm certainly wasn't going to build my own. So when a Honda came up for sale, even though it wasn't a Mini, I bought a Honda. So, I had 2-car trailer, I had a Mini and a Honda. It just got aggravating with having to take 2 sets of spares to the racetrack all the time. And that's why eventually I built a Mini and sold the Hondas. But the rental side of things, from a financial point of view only, if you don't race 4 weekends a year or more, you can't financially justify owning your own race car. And this is a very, very unpopular topic on Facebook and forums, but just hear my point of view. Most people consider the cost of the race car and the cost of maintenance, and that's their racing budget. But you also need a trailer, and you also need a vehicle to tow it to the track. And when you rent a car, all of that stuff is taken care of. So you don't need a tow vehicle and you don't need a trailer. So you have some cost savings there. And, just taking what that costs in the course of a year and amortizing it, 4 weekends is about the break-even point. But you're missing what your time is worth. And nobody ever figures their time into these calculations. So, a race weekend, depending on how many cars and how many classes there are, it may be 8 groups. So your group may not go out till 10:30 on a Saturday. We've had race weekends where our renters don't even come to the track on Friday. They just show up Saturday morning. They don't have to. We do all the unloading. We do all the prep. So they come, they get in the seat. We fit them the seat belts to them. We go through, the basics about the car, and they can, show up at 7 o'clock on Saturday morning and go out on track at 10 o'clock. And they've saved leaving work early on Friday, right?
Right.
And on Sunday, when racing is done, they get in their car and they go home. Whereas, we're there for 2 more hours, loading everything back up and then towing home at a slower rate. So if you add all that stuff together, financially, it's more expensive to own a race car than it is to rent a race car. Now, there's 100 reasons to own your own race car. So, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that everybody should rent. That's not the case at all. You want your car with stickers and graphics like you like it, you need to own it. You can't rent it that way. You want your seat in a certain position and you always want it in that position, and you want to be that comfortable in the car, and you want, special things, then you're going to want to own your own car. You like to fiddle with cars, you're going to own it instead of renting it. But, the average SCCA racer races about 2.5 weekends a year. So there's a lot of people who own race cars who could probably save money by renting a race car. Now, the biggest issue, of course, is if you have a $15,000 race car and you spent $15,000 on it, you've taken that out of your bank account now and you have it, and you wreck that car, you get to decide, when do I have enough money to fix it? You can wait a year, you can wait 2 years, you can wait 5 years. You might never fix it. But if you rent a car and you wreck it, you're expected to pay to get it fixed. and we have a security deposit and a contract to go along with that. So that's another reason maybe not to rent, right? Because you have to be prepared to write a check for whatever damage happens to the car over the course of the weekend.
Mm-hmm.
But for a lot of people, if I was just having this conversation with a racing friend earlier today, the biggest thing we have today is we have less time than we ever had before. And, the time is more valuable than the money. And that's one of the reasons why myself and Offline Racing out in California and Chris Taylor Racing Services down in Texas and plenty of other companies and Spec Miatas and Formula Enterprises and SRF3 and other classes. That's why racing rentals are such a big part of what we do, is there's a lot of people who can afford to race, but they can't afford the time that it takes to own, maintain a race car. They can't afford to leave Friday at noon to go to a racetrack because, the biggest indication of your ability to race is not what you do for a living or if you have passion or not, it's your zip code. Because if you live in the panhandle of Florida, you would think in Florida, ooh, you can race as much as you want to. No, everything's 8 hours.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. If you live in Iowa, ooh, that's even worse. Right. Colorado has a great racing community, but, Texas has a great racing community, but they're another place where all the tracks are long distances apart.
Mm-hmm.
And, that means leaving work early on Friday. And you do that 5 times a year, and that's 1 week of your vacation.
And Monday's no sure thing either if you're going that far.
No.
So
yeah.
Plus, if you don't know how to do it, like us.
Well, yeah, I mean,
this is true.
Like I said, I started with knowing nothing. So if I can do it, anybody can do it. That's the good news. But yeah, there's a learning curve, and you're going to make a lot of mistakes, and you're going to waste a lot of money making mistakes. And that's another advantage of renting, is you just don't have to go through that.
Yeah,
Right.
We figured out fairly quickly that an oil change does not occur at 3,000 track miles.
Yep.
For those playing the home game. So
yeah. So there's all kinds of stuff like that goes through, and little things you learn and checklists we've put together on stuff that makes no sense. So, but then you see the failure and you're like, I can't have this fail again. So you have to put a process in place to make sure it doesn't happen again.
Yeah.
I fully understand. The best thing about a checklist is when you actually use it, though, because we have them and sometimes they're ignored, but that's okay.
We try our best. We do.
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about this new class, the C Spec. Tell us about C Spec.
So again, working in the auto industry, I have access to a lot of data, and one of the things we're all aware of is manual transmission cars are practically impossible to find anymore new.
Mm-hmm.
So, the other thing that I took a look at is street cars have a life cycle, and when they're brand new, the manufacturers really support racing, right? So that, Subaru and Mazda are all about racing their brand new off the factory showroom new cars, and plenty of other brands have been involved in that in the past, where Honda with the Civic Type R, you can buy a actual race car from the factory brand new.
Mm-hmm.
So and then they're in this period of time where their basic use is transportation, and they're depreciating, and eventually they get inexpensive enough where it makes sense to turn them into a race car. And eventually, though, they get so old they go to scrap yards. And 30 years ago, when a car was in a scrap yard, you could buy it from the scrap yard and turn it into a race car, but no scrap yards do that anymore. So I started thinking about the idea that once these last manual transmission cars are in a scrapyard, they will never be able to be turned into race cars after that. So we have to make them into race cars before.
Mm-hmm.
And then, just kind of put that on the table and hold that. That's one thought. And then the second thought is, of all the people who came up to me during the B Spec process, as we were growing that class and say, oh, I would so much be into B Spec if the cars were just faster. And, so there's another item to put on the table to think about. And then the third one is, we're actually starting to see some shortages and difficulties finding donors in the B segment cars.
Mm-hmm.
The larger C segment cars are actually much, much more popular. So there's more Civics than there are Fits. There's more Focuses than there are Fiestas. There's more Cruises than there are Sonics. So, in each of these companies, there's more Corollas than there are Yaris. So there's a much higher percentage of vehicles available to turn into race cars. So I just brought all three of those thoughts together, and the idea, and back in 2021, I came up with the concept, and then early this year, I wrote a letter to the SCCA suggesting it, and yesterday in the SCCA fast tracks, that process is moving forward. There will be a new class of racing. At this point right now, it's not called C Spec, it's called Touring 5, but it's basically cars that fit in between the B Spec cars and the T4 cars. And T4 cars are Mazda MX-5s, Subaru BRZs, Mazda RX-8s, Ford Mustangs. So there's this opportunity, this window for cars that kind of fit in between there for us to turn them into race cars relatively inexpensively.
Awesome. So is that looking like next year then?
Yeah. So it's been announced. It's out for people to who are SCCA members to comment on, advise, suggest, say good things about, say bad things about, and then they'll make a final decision on how to implement all of that, everybody's suggestions. And yes, it's for starting next year.
Awesome.
So what cars are in this class of C Spec currently?
Well,
Or you're thinking of?
Well, I just named a bunch of them. So Focus, yeah. Dodge Dart, or the Chrysler aficionados. So cars of that size, the next size up from B Spec, in about the same 2000 to 2015 age range. And then, once we know what people want, because there's, in B Spec, there's 7 cars that are currently classified, 7, 8. In C Spec, there could be 40, because there's so many more options in the larger size. Not everybody had a small car in North America,
right?
But everybody has that next, what used to be called subcompacts, right? So everybody had a subcompact car they sold. So it's really hard for us to take 40 cars and make them even from the beginning. But if we can figure out, the 8 cars that everybody's going to build, like a Mazda 3 seems to be a pretty popular choice right now, then we'll do the work to try and make them even and then add the other cars in over time versus trying to start with 40, 50 different cars on the rule set right from the beginning.
Yeah, it's tough. I can just imagine how many permutations you could possibly come up with. Yep. Don't envy whoever gets stuck with that job.
No.
Doesn't sound like fun.
No.
So, I guess since you seem to have this way of getting stuff done, we have one request. One of the reasons our team didn't really get into the SCCA was we could never find a Rosetta Stone to figure out what you guys were talking about. Like, it took us a while to figure out that solo was autocross, because I thought it was I can drive solo, and I'm like, well, I want instruction, but I don't want solo. So is there a place where somebody could begin to understand the classing and the different classes and the different levels and the different Because it seems like you have something for everybody.
Yeah, and we almost do, but not really. And if there's one thing that's good or bad about the SCCA, it's exactly that. There was a logic and a straightforward process at one point, but we're now 40 years into it, 50 years into it, 60 years into it, and we've put band-aids and over band-aids over band-aids over band-aids.
Right.
And we've now really made it so that the outside person has a lot of difficulty. And if we come back to how do people get involved in racing, you remember one of the things I said from the beginning, the biggest way people get involved in racing is a friend has to walk them through the process.
Yeah.
Right. And, I always suggested, it was one of the suggestions, quit putting a website up with 500 documents and pieces of information and expecting people to read through it until they find the page that addresses their question.
Mm-hmm.
And just have a bunch of volunteers answering phones and just have people call. Right.
Or maybe a flow chart or something where I could sit there and say front wheel drive, rear wheel drive, lots of horsepower, no horsepower.
I think there's a whole better way to go that. And, part of the process that we have is we don't really have a ladder system.
Right.
So it's not like, these cars are in class 1, 2, and 3. And then if you add a rear sway bar, you move them to classes 4, 5, and 6. When you add the rear sway bar, cars 2 and 3 move into 5, and 1 moves into 6, and none of them move into 4 because then there's a whole nother group of cars in 4. It's just really, really confusing.
Yeah.
Because there's no logical step to it. And it's because each one of those classes functions independently and has to make decisions on how, they keep some level of equality in their cars that they have. Like most classes within the SCCA do not guarantee that just because a car is in the class, it's competitive.
Right.
Right. And, that's the unfortunate thing. We run into a lot of different cars where a lot of different classes where there's 3 or 4 cars that are the cars to have, and the other 30 cars in the class just are never going to be competitive. And, it's one of the things we've tried to do with B Spec is to make that more level across all the cars in the class.
Yeah, it seems pretty balanced just from the to go racing jargon. The BOP seems to be pretty level.
Yep.
So, sir, if people want to contact you, maybe they've gotten interest, or maybe they just have questions about it, is there a way for them to contact you or follow what your guys are up to?
Yeah, there's 2 different ways. So the website for our rentals are grasspaddock.com. I like to say Grass Paddock is our attitude. It's not an indication of where we're located at the racetrack. If you go to a racetrack, there's the people who have a lot of money who can rent garages, and then the people who have a little bit of money are typically on the pavement, and then the rest of us are all on the grass area. So it's that kind of mentality. We're more of the social guys over the course of a weekend where we're sleeping in our trailers and hanging out together instead of, rushing off to our Marriott, as soon as everything's done on Friday. B Spec specifically has a webpage as well. It's b-spec.org. And we get information from there as well. Obviously, the Facebook groups. I can't answer all the questions, directly myself, but we have a pretty good group of people where you go on any of those Facebook groups and ask a question and you get an answer pretty quick. Or you post wrong information, you get an answer immediately.
I know you say you can't answer them all, but it seems like you do. You're doing a great job.
Well, I appreciate that.
No worries.
to, for me, racing is a lot about mental health. So I'm probably, like I said, I used to be wound pretty tight. I'm still wound tighter than I should be. But for me, being strapped into a race car, everybody's like, "Oh, the adrenaline, your heart rate must go through the roof." And I mean, I haven't measured my heart rate, but I know that being in a race car strapped in is like the most calm place I know of in the world. And
Mhm.
that just kind of goes against what people would think. And maybe it's like dogs with thunder blankets. Maybe it's the strapping in process that makes me feel safe and secure. But I'm if you see me in the paddock, I'm awake. I don't sleep a lot. But if you see me on the grid in the car, uh, you know, chances are my eyes are closed, and if I'm not careful, I'll fall asleep before they let us out on the track. So I try not to get to the grid too early,
Mm.
just because it's a nice, comfortable, and relaxing place for me.
Well, we want to thank you very much for coming on. This was very, very informative.
Well, I'm happy to help, and hopefully we find a few more people to, even if it's not B Spec or American Sedan or Grid Life. And by the way, I've been to a couple of I've been to one Grid Life event, and my team went to another one at Pittsburgh. So,
Oh,
um,
nice. Did you do the
I
endurance race?
my team did.
Oh, nice.
I was in where was I? Was I in Daytona? I think I was racing Daytona that weekend. No, I was at Roebling Road for the Southeast Championship down in Savannah. But so one of the things we do differently about Grass Paddock Motorsports with our rentals, most rental companies have a semi in a home office with a big warehouse where they got 30 cars, and then they take the semi 2,000 miles across the country to the racetrack or wherever they tend to go. And we're less we're less centralized. So what we have is cars located around the eastern United States. We have 2 cars in Florida. We have 2 cars in Georgia. We have cars in Cleveland, cars in Toledo, and cars in Michigan. We're looking at putting cars west of Chicago. We're looking at putting cars in the mid-Atlantic, North Carolina, Virginia area, so that the cars are always close to the tracks. Because when you rent a car, you have to pay for the transportation of getting the car to the track. So that way we cut down on those costs.
Well, it's becoming apparent to me why there's none for sale, Frank. I'm just saying, you got all these cars everywhere. You got to share, man. We need some.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for coming.
And I mean, when you really look at the other classes within SCCA racing, even though we're getting close to 150 cars now, that's still not many. So what's interesting is, from a participation point of view, we're the 4th largest class in SCCA nationally, and we're the 3rd largest at the national championship runoffs. But we don't have anywhere close to the 3rd or 4th amount of cars. So what that means is people who run our class of racing run many more weekends a year than people who run other types of cars. And I think that has a lot to do with the cost per weekend in terms of tires and gas and brake pads and all the other kind of stuff. And because we're not really stressing the car, most of the cars in the class are racing at less horsepower than they come from the factory.
Right.
So, we're not stretching the car to the limit of its performance, so that things break on a regular basis.
In spite of that, they do put down some pretty good times. If you look at some of the track times, I was like, wow. Some of the top people in B Spec were putting down times that some of our team were putting down in a E46 M3. It was a street car, but whatever. And it was just like, I was like, well, that's either really, really good or embarrassing, depending on which side of the fence you're on there. Well, sir, hopefully we will get to meet you in real life, and thank you for coming on. It was a pleasure getting to know you a bit better, and hopefully we got a few more people motivated for B Spec, and now all we have to do personally is finish up 2 cars and start having some fun on our own.
Yeah, or come rent one a weekend.
I know. I was thinking about that. Well, we've
Oh.
we've
So the nice thing about renting is you might find out that it's not for you, right? So if you do all the investing first,
yeah.
then you're kind of upside down in that whole process. So,
Hmm.
just maybe find a track. And that's the other thing. We had a person rent one of our cars at the national championship at VIR,
Mm-hmm.
but he owns his own car. He lived in Colorado,
Yeah.
and he found it was less expensive to rent from us than it was for him to take his own car to the track. And,
Yeah.
I don't know what part of the country you guys are in. Where are you located?
Up near Scranton, northeastern Pennsylvania.
All right. So you've always wanted to run Sebring. I'm sure of it, right?
Well, absolutely. Well, actually, the VIR is on our list. We have never gotten there yet. We're working on it though.
Yeah. Well, VIR is within a reasonable towing distance for you, but Sebring is not, or
No,
Daytona, right?
no.
You're talking about more than a day on the road,
Yep.
which means taking off Thursday and Friday to get there, and Monday to get back.
Maybe
And
Tuesday.
yeah, maybe Tuesday, depending on when you get done on Sunday. And when
Exactly.
you add all of that stuff together, that's what we try to offer. We have cars that are convenient to Watkins Glen and Sebring, and it's not going to break the bank in either of those locations. So, we have people who use us. The cars, it's not the same car, but they're functionally identical.
Mhm.
So, they drive at Sebring and then they want to drive at Watkins Glen and they just fly in,
Right.
right?
So, asking for a friend who looks like me just a little bit, would there be like a one lap of America package, perhaps that we could talk about?
Yeah, I've thought about that. We could certainly make something available. The only thing I would say is, I was very clear that when I started racing, I drove my race car to the track.
Hmm.
I would never recommend to anybody to drive a car with a full cage on the road.
Yeah.
No, that's illegal anyway, isn't it?
It's not
I
illegal,
don't.
but it's really stupid.
It is
Yeah,
stupid.
I don't know if it's. Look, I mean, so I wouldn't even recommend you drive on the road with a 5-point seatbelt. And,
Right.
again, working in the auto industry, the reason seatbelts have 3 points and not 4 points is because we're trying to change the deceleration curve of the body. And when you have 4 points, the body deceleration is more instantaneous. That's why we had basal skull fractures,
Hmm.
which
Mm-hmm.
is why we had to have something like the Hans, because we were literally having people who were having impacts, and it was catastrophic.
Right.
So
Yeah.
3 points in an airbag is much better. And then on the other side of it, I wouldn't put a car on a racetrack to race it with airbags in it, because most accidents on a racetrack have multiple impacts.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to be in control in between the two impacts.
Right.
And with an airbag, after you have the first one, you're along for the ride.
Yeah.
So
If you're awake.
yeah, if you lose control and hit a tire wall, and not too hard, and I just did this not a couple of race weekends ago at Mid Ohio, I went off and did a glancing blow on the tire wall, and had the airbag gone off, I probably would have gone back on track in front of traffic. But
Yeah.
because it didn't go off, I was able to stay off the track, you know?
Mhm.
So that's what I'm talking about in terms of, safety and those kind of items. Not that I'm any sort of expert. This is just my opinion. So
Sure. Yeah. The other thing you can do is turn off your auto 911 call from your cell phone if you're using it for your telemetry. In
Oh.
case you that's not good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Well, again, Frank, thank you so much. This has been
Thank
really
you.
enjoyable. Yeah.
did we miss anything that somebody needs to know anything about that we weren't smart enough to ask a good question?
No, I think we covered pretty much everything. And
Yeah.
certainly, while I'm a proponent for B Spec and C Spec, or whatever the class is going to be called, what I'm really doing is, trying to do the best that I can to help people find the right kind of motorsports for them. So wheel-to-wheel racing isn't for everybody. HPDE time trials isn't for everybody. Every class isn't for everybody. And the last thing I want to do is convince somebody to get involved in B Spec where it's really not going to make them happy. So talk to somebody. When people want to get involved in racing, the first thing I tell them is find a local event and go volunteer and work, because you will find more inside information in a weekend of working at a track than you will find in a month of keyboard warrioring on the internet, searching and sending out messages to people. So
for sure.
Well, there you go.
Well, we share the opinion, and hopefully we can all of us get some more people involved and having a great time, because it's what we enjoy the most, I think. So thank you again, sir. We will undoubtedly meet you in person at some point, and we hope to have you on again at some point.
All right. I hope so. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Have a great night, sir. Thanks. Bye.
Hey, I cannot hear you.
Oh, that's a problem. That's the
he
better.
Can't hear us. You can talk. He's not hearing it.
We can ask any question we want now.
He's like, I can't hear you. Bill's like, well, how about if you try this?
When you get a chance afterwards, if you could send over a few pictures, could be you, could be your cars, could be whatever, and we'll just use them to promote the episode and plaster the internets and get millions and millions and millions and billions of people to ignore our podcast. But some of them will.
Oh, stop.
Well, if you look at the number of people in the world versus the number of people who listen, it's a very small fraction we're looking for. So it's okay. So, all right, sir. Welcome to the podcast.